Welcome back to the Dr. Joe Show. I got Dan, my co-host, with me here today. Thanks for coming back for another show.
Glad to be back. It's been a while. We took the holidays got away from us, but we're back with more stuff. We got some Zoom interviews coming up too, and we had some Zoom other ones on the pod. So we didn't exactly leave you guys alone. Yeah. We had some Zoom interviews here and there, but these well-produced pods and the shorts. So we took a month off. But
yeah, we did. It was a little more than a month.
We're back with you've been wanting to do this since day one. And I said, let's wait. Let's save it for a rainy day. Yeah. And the rainy day is here. Mm-hmm. Not literally, but it maybe. But science versus scientism. I tweeted this once, and I got way more replies than normal.
Yeah.
Just by tweeting that thing, people thought I was picking a side already. Mm-hmm. They're like, "Oh, so you're anti-establishment." I didn't say anything. I just said science versus scientism.
Oh.
So why is it so polarizing? It's just that phrase.
Well, there's probably the propensity for fear, like everything. People like to get afraid, and fear sells. And then there's ridicule, and there's use of psychology to manipulate people. So let's just talk about science and scientism. Science refers to, without a dictionary in front of me, science refers to the scientific method, where you go through a series of well-established processes to answer a question. You have your introduction, your materials and methods, your results, your conclusion. And the other thing is that it's reproducible. So the first thing I learned in evidence-based decision-making, which was a part of medical school training, was, so EBDM, evidence-based decision-making, was, well, I'll ask you, Dan, what's the most important thing about a research study? What's the first thing that you should always look at?
The sponsor.
The sponsor. Who funded the study?
Who's funding it? What is it that they're studying?
And those things I listed, the funder isn't part of any of that, okay? But it's the most important part. We've talked about it with aspartame. We've talked about the fact that there's a neurologist on the payroll for one of the biggest aspartame companies on the planet. Mm-hmm. The same neurologist who writes the toxicological studies and reports on aspartame saying that it's safe, and it's not. Aspartame is not safe. So that's an example of the importance of the. So
this is the article. There's far more scientific fraud than anyone wants to admit. This is they're specifically talking about academic medical centers on non-industry sponsored studies. So interestingly enough, big pharma that everyone wants to hate, in this case, when they do a study, they're not hiding anything. They're studying their drug. Mm-hmm. It's pretty cut and clear. They're studying their drug. When you're studying nutritional benefits or the downsides of a particular chemical like aspartame, mm-hmm. It's more shrouded in mystery. Who's actually paying for this study? To show that aspartame is mm-hmm. actually not bad for you. It's in a way, and Big Pharma gets bashed a lot. I think way too much. Some of it's fair, but a lot of it's unfair. You can trust that over this kind of research.
And that gets more difficult to talk about because there's inclusion bias, which is something that's not talked about very much. Specifically antifungal medications. And this was demonstrated by a study that I found in in residency training. I can't find the study anymore, but basically one of the attending physicians, well-established, prominent academic guy, was gently guiding me towards the reality that pharmaceutical industries were intentionally not comparing certain antifungals to each other because they already knew what the answer was going to be. Mm-hmm. So you look at it as, we just dropped $1 billion on this thing, and we already know that study is going to make us lose that money. So how about we do this other study that's going to compare something else
I see.
and put it in a different light.
Instead of like cannibalizing their own
Yeah.
IP.
So maybe best case scenario, maybe the thing that they blew a bunch of money on that isn't the best choice. Maybe it kind of works. Maybe it works, but it doesn't work as good as the thing that would have been compared to it.
And somehow
they do this so that they can sell their product.
But see, the FDA, well, at least for the drug industry, that's what I'm familiar with. They meet with the company that's proposing the study, and they don't just let them do whatever they want. They go back and say, no, you can't use this comparator. You have to use this one because we don't want another Me Too drug. We want to make sure that this is clearly better, more safe, and efficacious than current standard of treatment. So you can't just compare it to the old gen stuff. You have to compare it to the latest stuff. Because a lot of the pharma and biotechs try to do that. And the FDA does have some safeguards in place. But what you're talking about is something different.
Yeah.
Academic studied,
funded
funded trials.
Well, and there's the other problem of repurposed drugs. So drugs that are perfectly effective for multiple things, and nobody wants to look at it because there's no money to make on the patent because it's already decades into being generic, and we're just not going to look at it.
I think it's a 503 loophole or category where you can skip we actually had a study like this for that spray. I can't say more.
Right, the spray. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
So they could bypass phase 1 and 2 because it's already an approved, well-studied compound.
So basically, like, it does so good that they just cut the study, right?
You go straight to phase 3 to just try the new formulation and the new method of delivery, but the safety of the actual IP is not in question anymore, which is the purpose of like phase 1 and phase 2. So you're just going straight to efficacy and long-term safety, which long-term safety is always done.
Right.
But this is why I actually think like industry-sponsored trials are more honest than these academic-sponsored stuff. I mean, most of the fraud in this article that we just saw, they're talking about fraud in academia, which is like our holiest of holies.
Well,
like sites like Yuma Clinical Trials, we're nowhere near like the holy of holies to like Harvard.
Well, is it holy of holies though? Because wasn't it one of the Ivy League schools that was the reason for the sugar scandal from like the 50s and 60s that brushed that data under the rug and implicated cholesterol as the problem with heart disease?
Yeah.
So that was one of the Ivy League schools.
That's right.
One or two researchers that got bribed. So
I think it's scrambling for initial funding because by the time we see the drugs, like we're here at Yuma Clinical Trials, we're working with the industry sponsored, like they already have commercial applications, at least a theory of where something can go. There's less potential for fraud there. It's very strictly regulated. But when you're talking about these academics writing papers and just doing like these proof of concept or epidemiological, like large studies, there's more potential for fraud there. And there's more potential for shrouding like the actual objective or who the funder actually is. It's less cut and dry. It's more open-ended. Let's just do this and see what happens. But what you're saying is one can place the pieces in such a way to where you kind of already know what the result's going to be.
right.
Which you can't really do that in industry-sponsored trials. But at the AMC, where you're just like a guy in a lab or a gal in a lab these days studying things, you can kind of fudge the numbers a lot more. Because no one's really watching you.
I did bench research, and there was nobody watching us. There was nobody watching. I mean, I got nothing against the lab I worked at.
Do you ever get audited, though? Or
the lab I worked at was great, but I mean, I don't remember anybody making sure of anything.
But did anyone even ever tell you, like, you could be audited at some point? Or, like, they could walk in anytime and audit?
I'm sure that was mentioned at some point.
Okay.
But also, it was kind of disorganized, like because we dealt with cell culture stuff, and so sometimes I couldn't find where my cells ended up. I would put them in a specific part of the liquid nitrogen freezer, and then I'm like, oh, well, where did it go? And oh yeah, we moved it around. Like, oh, okay, thanks, Mike. Who moved it? And he's like, oh, I don't know.
And then that's it. And a very important part of the study.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we were the cells. We were differentiating them into anyway. So, yeah, I mean, I was more a cog in the machine at that time. I wasn't fully aware. I was just trying to get into research and learn, you know. So, but yeah, I'm sure we could have been audited.
But the concept of science for scientism, because
scientism. So people, well, first of all, it's not a word in the dictionary, right, folks?
Right.
Scientism. It's something that sounds almost conspiratorial. But the reality is, if you don't look at who funded a study critically, or if there's no funding that the study took, that's even more suspicious to me.
Who authored that study?
Yeah, then you look at the primary author of the study because it's like a position paper, an opinion paper, or a review of whatever, and sometimes it's a quick Google search that tells you, believe it or not, that, oh, that person's on the board of the company of the thing that was studied that they're saying is good. So, but no funding. There's no financial disclosures. Well, of course, you're on the board of the company. So,
yeah. Do you think we're in the era of science as religion?
Yes, we are. We're definitely there. And that's a dangerous place to be. That's a very dangerous place to be. Well, because if you start to say phrases like trust the science, you're basically telling people to shut up and stop asking questions.
Yeah.
And by now, if people don't realize that what happened with the last 3 years of our country's history and the world's history, if people don't think there's something wrong with science by now, get out from under your rock and start paying attention. I think our trust has been betrayed for a lot of reasons. And I do think that real science is coming back. I think there's a lot more honesty that's coming out now. But I do think there's quite a bit of censorship still.
In what ways do you think it's getting better? Hopefully.
Well, there's a lot more data coming out, for example, on the toxicity of certain things. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a lot more data coming out on alternative therapies for certain things. But
alternative treatment options, alternative therapies,
mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. But the FDA is always going to come after groups that, or products, for example, where there's testimonials. So testimonials are actually becoming illegal. So riddle me this, folks. Are testimonials free speech? Is that First Amendment rights?
It depends, because it gets tricky. There's this. Are you aware of what this subset of? There's something called patient advocates now, mm-hmm. and there's also patient influencers that are supposedly the voice piece for the patients.
Okay,
but they're actually paid by pharma, so you can hire a patient influencer. They call them patient advocates. Mm-hmm. They go to conferences, they speak, not necessarily about this drug did this for me or this drug did that. It's not that blatant, mm-hmm. but it's more along the lines of, this is a path we should spend more money on. These are underserved populations that need this treatment, need this access. It's a huge, and it's a growing sector of our industry.
But what do these advocates do? Like, they're just making statements?
They're essentially promoting what the pharma who can afford them, because only the big pharma really can do this.
See, I'm already kind of leery of that. But
well, of course, we should be. This is the whole point
we
of
can pay
saying
for this. Like, I mean, you're having people do stuff. That doesn't make what they're saying right or wrong,
but it's not illegal necessarily.
Okay,
so it's kind of the next extension of the testimonial that you brought up.
So, but just theoretically, there's a product online that is touted as some, like, we'll say it's a spray of some kind, okay, and the spray does certain things, and then people start using the spray, and they start to notice, hey, I can use a spray for this and this and this, and hey, I had this problem for years, and then I used it on this thing on my hand, and it got better, and nothing any doctor gave me helped it to get better. And the FDA is censoring things like that. And
without doing clinical trials, right?
if it's an anecdote, and if people recognize it as an anecdote, I think I would call that free speech.
I think that's for the nutraceuticals get into this gray area. Where they come out with a supplement, and maybe they do a study, but it's not like a rigorous clinical trial like we do here.
Sure.
It's just one that they kind of put together, right? And
Yeah.
they know the FDA is never going to audit it because they're not actually even going for FDA approval. But then they can say, we got testimonials from our study of people who had good results, and then they have that little asterisk, not indicative of all results, or whatever the legal jargon is that they have
or
to
this
put
statement's not approved by the FDA, or
something like
whatever.
that, yeah. Or this may not be indicative of your results, or something like that. Do you think that's okay? I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I think people are discerning enough to know when that's kind of
I think they
BS
are. I think they are. So if a government agency is coming in and censoring speech, because that's what it is, it's censorship of First Amendment rights.
I see.
When customer testimonials that are real get taken away, I think that's wrong. Because, well, I mean, I think it's obvious.
But the counterpoint would be the recent, well, not recent, but last decade before COVID came out, the stem cells were like the big thing, right?
Oh, they're still big.
Still. Now they're coming back. But
now
like
people are talking about
clinic,
stimulating your stem cells to wake up and do stuff for you.
pluripotent and all that. But the feds went out and shut down a bunch of these places because they said they were going overboard, making false claims, charging people too much money, and they really weren't. They didn't have proof. They didn't do clinical trials to be able to make those claims.
Yeah.
Well, how do you feel about that kind of stuff? That's a different category.
Well, I mean, I would like to see that stuff. I mean, definitely with stem cells, because that requires a lot of research if you're going to use those for something.
So I guess we just got to figure out where the line in the sand needs to be drawn.
I mean, PRP therapy, platelet-rich plasma.
Yeah.
It's almost not reimbursable at all by insurance. Okay.
Yeah, it's all cash.
It's all cash pay.
Yeah.
But folks, what is platelet-rich plasma? You basically, let's say I have an injury somewhere, and the sports medicine doctor or the orthopedic surgeon takes some of my blood out. They spin it down. They throw away the red cells, and they keep that little fraction of platelet-rich plasma. They pull it into a syringe, and they inject it into my injured area. The platelets rupture, and healing ensues. So that's being experimented with. There's a lot of, but I think they're being transparent about it. They're saying, yeah, this is experimental.
Right.
So then
you sign a consent.
you sign a consent saying it's experimental and it's a cash pay thing. So that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. But what about getting one of those patients on your website saying, I did this and it worked? I mean, I would say that's okay too.
Well, yeah. So if that's okay, like if I use PRP to grow part of my hair back, if a lady with lichen sclerosis uses it to get that fixed, if you use it for all kinds of different things, I mean, I don't think those people are getting censored. There are specialists charging people money for that procedure. So how is it that a harmless product on the internet where people put a bunch of testimonials, how did those testimonials get shut down? That's the FDA should not have that kind of dictatorial power.
Right. Do you think someone should, in regards to not just communication, but standardization of the process?
Yeah, I mean, is the FDA regulated? We have to ask that question. Who do they answer to? Does anybody know who they answer to? Congress?
I think it's the president, no?
The president? I mean, I don't know who they answer to.
Yeah,
it doesn't seem like they answer to anybody.
Well, we get into the topic of regulatory capture, which we can go down that path or not.
Yeah.
It's indicative of the corruption that does exist, but I think in some respects is unavoidable because for those that don't know, regulatory capture, it's like the revolving door between industry and regulations, right? And hey, there's going to be a job for you here, vice versa. But the rational argument for that is there's not that many people that have your expertise from industry level that want to be regulator, would love to have you as regulator, or vice versa. You're a regulator, you understand that process. We'd like to have you work in industry. So on one hand, you're a public servant. On the other hand, you're a capitalist cog in the wheel.
That's an issue because...
But it's everywhere. It's not just science. It's everywhere.
Well, things get so complex. Let's say I'm some amazing innovator, some amazing engineer, and there's only 2 other engineers on the planet who are as good as me. Let's just say that's a scenario. Well, those are the only 2 engineers who can appraise my ideas. And that's true for a lot of things. So, yeah, from the regulatory side, if you have somebody who's capable, who can appraise and make sense of whatever the thing is, again, judicious use. That's the question.
Back to how science versus scientism relates to kind of the theme of our show, which is food, nutrition, health. That's what you're all about. You're a practicing clinician also. And I see your patients coming out of meetings with you, and I hear some of the conversations, and you seem to be encouraging them to get on the right track. But what studies do you actually have? Because it's so hard to find.
What studies do I have?
Like you say, it's so hard to find like support for even our first video, coenzyme Q10.
Yeah, CoQ10. There's plenty of old studies on that. The studies on CoQ10 are decades old.
But like new stuff, no one's doing new stuff.
But see, why do we need new stuff?
I don't know. To keep it, because people like new stuff. Like they like new. Like what's the latest science?
At what point does seeking for new stuff become just a money making scheme?
Right.
Because if CoQ10 can more or less consistently drop blood pressure 5 to 30 points within months, hypothetically. And that's been established. Let's just say, why would more studies need to be done on it? Well, more studies should be done on it to reproduce the results, right?
Well, who would pay for it? That's the thing.
Yeah, that's the problem. Nobody's going to pay for it because the priority is making money. That's the priority. That's the reality that we live in.
And it doesn't really need a compound like that is already perfected enough to where it works effectively without tweaking it or doing anything else.
Well, there's a theory, and it's held probably by most naturopaths that if the human body gets everything it needs, there should be no dis-ease.
You think that's possible?
Yeah. If you eat the right things, if you have the ideal human diet, which I think evades most of us, but CoQ10 is a piece of that.
But also the environmental factors, though, like the air we breathe.
Well, there's the air you breathe. There's the toxins in the air.
Or another scientism debate, global warming, CO2.
Oh boy, you're going to get us canceled if we start talking about that.
There's no way we can do scientism without at least mentioning this.
Well, yeah. So, like NASA doesn't want to talk about how powerful the sun is. The sun dictates our weather. there's numerous studies showing that the sun's solar activity, solar rays, flares, CMEs, they seed thunderstorms and they seed hurricanes. That's well known. The sun just recently blasted us with a
Gamma rays?
well, there was an X-ray burst a few days ago, and then there was
a few days ago.
A few days ago, yeah. So the cloudiness that we see, I mean, every time there's increased solar activity in Yuma, there's always a bunch of clouds that appear, and they just kind of sit around, and it's because energy is being shot into our global electric circuit.
Because Yuma's not really supposed to get clouds.
No,
right?
Yuma doesn't get a lot of clouds
Just
at all.
monsoons, and that's it.
Except when a tropical storm is strong enough to blast through the coast and barge in here and flash flood. So yeah, the sun dictates a lot of that stuff, but people want to downplay the effect that the sun has.
And
know?
the impact it has on evolution, on disease, like you said. I read that the other day, actually, that the reason we have our DNA in our bone marrow and fish don't is because of the water. And the water protects from the gamma rays of the sun. So there was no need to have it hidden in bone to protect.
Yeah.
But then when the fish made their way to land, there are some fish that have
They have marrow.
and that's why humans have it in the bones. And fish don't, for the most part.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because of the gamma rays back to the sun. Because primarily that's where they're coming from.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's interesting
That
stuff.
makes sense. Wow.
Yeah. Twitter's a good place. But any other final thoughts you want to have on this? We'll come back to this topic in the future, but
Scientism.
we just want to whet people's beaks, see
Yeah.
what the community actually thinks about this.
I'm curious to see what people are going to think about this discussion. People think that there might not be examples. There's plenty of examples of this. And I think our first aspartame podcast,
That was great.
I think I produced, and if I didn't, I can produce it in the future, the review article. All of the industry-funded studies, 100% of them showed that aspartame was safe. And then of all the non-industry funded studies, 92% of them showed that it was not safe. So that's a very clear example of science versus scientism. That review article reveals scientism as a reality.
And you can just follow the funding sources and make your own decision.
There's funding sources. Then if there are no financial disclosures, look at the authors
and their connections to
and look at what the author does
industry.
for a living. Yeah.
Yeah. It's another form of maybe regulatory capture, but instead of regulatory capture, it's scientist capture.
Well, I think another issue is that everybody's innocent until proven guilty. And there needs to be more scrutiny on what we call science, because this stuff gets published into books, and then it gets disseminated, and
then med school
thousands, millions of people will learn this stuff as gospel, and that's very dangerous.
And the things like the food pyramid,
like the food pyramid
get taught, and
like look at what the USDA just did.
So that's an example.
They put
of
Lucky
science.
Charms, for example, on there, and it's a great tasting
Did
cereal.
they get rid of the food pyramid, or is it still? It's not being pushed.
I'm not even
They
sure.
used to push that stuff when we were like the same age.
Yeah.
In junior high, elementary, it was like the food pyramid was like gospel. Okay, I got to eat. Like, this is what I got to
Yeah.
eat today.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, so most of those processed cereals, they have protein in them, but they're all made of corn, and they all cause horrible allergies. They make people gain weight. They cause diabetes, type 2.
Metabolic syndrome.
And yeah, like maybe I don't have a study that proves that, but my clinical practice says so. And most other doctors who are paying attention to what their patients eat are also going to say so. And all the naturopaths are going to say so. So it's...
You think most doctors, though, and we'll wrap up with this, but I know you don't speak for most doctors, but you work you're a doctor yourself, clinician. Do you think doctors actually want to get to the root of the cause, or they just want quick fix, come back in 6 weeks, I'll get your refill. We're going to manage your symptoms and not the root cause. Because you and Dr. Smith do it a lot differently over there. And I know there's others like you out there.
I think when we are in medical school, we learn the right way to think and to do things. And definitely if you go see a specialist, that specialist went into their specialty so that they could think more in their specialty. So, you send somebody to a rheumatologist, they're going to think deeply about what inflammatory things are going on here or what inherited genetic things are going on here. Oncologists, they're going to delve deeply into looking for a blood dyscrasia or a hematological problem or a cancer or whatever. So, but you're asking about primary care doctors?
Any doctor.
Well,
just getting to
if
the
you're a
root
specialist,
cause.
yeah. But if you're a specialist who's doing procedures all day, the specialists who are turning out, lots of scopes of whatever kind, doing lots of whatever of the procedure they're doing, it just depends on the individual. Some of them just want to do procedures and they don't want to do a lot of thinking. Some of them just don't want to have a lot of that going on. It just depends on what healthcare system you work in and what support you have around you to have the time to spend with patients.
And some of the healthcare systems don't incentivize you. They actually incentivize you not to think.
Yeah.
They incentivize you to do.
Well,
and we're one step away from AI is becoming doctors.
Well, most hospitalist programs, for example, every hospitalist should know about that famous study where 15, 16 patients on your census, that means the number of people you're seeing in a day. That's about the sweet spot where there's minimal errors. Once you add more patients to a hospitalist census, the number of errors starts to increase significantly. And in residency, we were protected from this. But then there was one non-teaching team that got dumped on. Okay. So they tried to protect the academic side, but the reality is you go into the real world and everybody has 23 today. Sorry. Like, what are you going to do? Somebody's sick. They're in the hospital. What are you going to do? So, it would be good if hospitals had more people on call just to be per diem, just to help keep the numbers down. Well, there needs to be something like that because people hate being in the hospital. I mean, it's miserable enough to be in the hospital.
Well, the counter argument to that is scary, especially in the context of this video, because they're talking very seriously about AI making these decisions.
Making what decisions?
These clinical ones. And with the value is there won't be error or much less error. But they're pre-programmed to do what the system says.
Yeah, and so there has to be a decision made. So who is going to make the clinical decisions? The
algorithm.
First, they have to prove that a robot can diagnose acute appendicitis. First, they have to establish that an AI can take a full history from somebody and without even examining them, get a diagnosis sometimes, because there's a lot of issues that you can diagnose purely from history. I mean, the internet can be useful in diagnosing people. So, I mean, I have had patients correctly diagnose themselves after a thorough, conscientious internet search. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, but there needs to be a lot of attention paid to the fund of knowledge and putting things together. Because
that's what I'm saying.
Because people can't be reduced to a series of
algos, of ones and zeros,
of algorithms, because uncommon presentations of common problems is still what makes medicine one of the most interesting things.
There you go.
Like you read a textbook like, oh yeah, this is the typical presentation, but no, they didn't look like that, but that's what it was.
Yeah.
This
is why this topic's so important, and this is just to whet people's appetite. But science versus scientism, if we don't learn to differentiate these two, and you being the human being watching this, You don't need to be a clinician, just an informed individual, just to know the difference, know that this is an issue before the system takes over, because this is just gonna pour gasoline on it.
Yeah. The other thing to think about, folks, is if you eventually start trying to replace doctors with machines, what are you going to do if and when those machines break and then there's no doctors left who actually know the art? So the whole discussion of AI replacing doctors, it should be shot down. Now, AI assisting doctors, there is a place for AI assistance. You know, some people, they want help with their differential diagnosis. Oh, hey, you know, I didn't think about that virus. Oh, I didn't think about that type of injury, you know. AI can be useful for that, but general AI, whenever general AI gets here, you can bet there's going to be physical altercations if there's any talk of replacing doctors with robots. That's what I predict, and I think there should be, if it ever comes to that.
For sure. Then there will be. The problem is you won't need as many, and they're going to be hired by large systems. Like every town has one.
Well, they're not going to be hired. They're just going to be built and sold, the robots.
The robots, but the humans that are backing it up.
Yeah.
They're not going to be practitioners, but they will stay active, and they're going to follow what the algorithm says.
Oh, yeah.
That's the dystopian view that I think we're headed down that path. Smith said it. He would say it on this podcast. He said, in 10 years, I'm replaced. It's going to be a MA walking around with an iPad. I think you were there when he said this.
Yeah.
He's a very practical dude. Like, he's not a futurist.
There's being able to predict what's coming and to see the patterns.
Yeah.
You know, and
so if it's not 10, it's 20, 30.
And for the folks who think that humans used to be over 900 years old, you know, it makes you wonder, was our genetics altered so that we would not develop, you know, the perception of pattern recognition in human history? You know, live a shorter life so you don't see the patterns.
Or back to the sun. Did it go through cycles? And
the sun goes through cycles live longer. Every 6,000 years.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Joe. I missed you, man. This is a good one.
I missed you too,
good to have you
Dan.
back. We're back, guys. Everyone like, subscribe, comment, share. Thank you.
Thank you, folks.